It's a painful thing to discover you are the unwanted guest at your own grandson's wedding, but that is precisely the revelation that shattered my world. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. They would soon learn that the slight they dealt me would cost them dearly. The words still echo in my mind, a shard of broken glass lodged in my chest. My own son didn't truly want me there. My name is Arthur Holmes. I am 68 years old, and up until that day I had believed with the certainty of a lifetime that I understood the profound meaning of family. I had always imagined that after dedicating the entirety of my adult life to my son and my grandson, I would be a cherished presence, welcomed with open and loving arms wherever they might be. I had never been so profoundly, so painfully wrong. The whole devastating affair began with the invitation to Leo's wedding, my one and only grandson. When the thick, cream-colored envelope finally appeared in my mailbox, a full 3 weeks after I knew for a fact that all the other guests had received theirs, I initially dismissed it as a simple delay with the postal service. But as I held it, a small, cold knot of unease began to form in my stomach. The invitation itself seemed impersonal, almost an afterthought. My name and address were printed in a generic font, a stark contrast to the elegant handwritten calligraphy I had seen on the invitations shared by Leo's friends across their social media pages. Still, I pushed the feeling down. The sheer joy of being included, of being invited to witness such a momentous day, was enough to make me willfully ignore the warning signs. My preparations began immediately and spanned several weeks. I purchased a new suit, a distinguished charcoal gray that I thought would complement the wedding's color scheme. More importantly, I took my late father's antique gold watch to be serviced and polished, intending to present it to Leo as a family heirloom. It was a piece I had safeguarded for decades, waiting for this exact special moment to pass it on. My finances, drawn from a modest teacher's retirement pension, were tight, but I diligently saved for 6 months to ensure I could give the newlyweds a generous check, a small nest egg to help them start their new life together. On the day of the wedding, I made sure to arrive early, filled with anticipation. The venue was breathtaking, a grand hall that looked like something out of a fairy tale. Cascades of white flowers seemed to fall from the high ceilings, and thousands of twinkling fairy lights were woven into the decor, casting a magical, ethereal glow over everything. This was the kind of wedding Leo had always dreamed of, and it was clear that Daniel, my son, and his wife Jessica had spared no expense in making it perfect. Jessica, a high-powered partner at her mother's corporate law firm, certainly had the resources to ensure every detail was flawless. With a hopeful heart, I made my way to the escort card table, looking for my name among the sea of small, tinted cards that would guide each guest to their assigned seat. I scanned the entire display, a beautifully arranged wall of cards organized meticulously in alphabetical order. Hamilton, Harper, Hendricks. My eyes passed over the names again and again. Nothing under H for Holmes. A wave of confusion washed over me. I located one of the wedding coordinators, a young woman with a clipboard and an efficient air. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a little tighter than I intended. "I can't seem to find my card. The name is Arthur Holmes." "Holmes? Let me check," she replied, her pen tapping against her list. As she scanned the page, I saw a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her expression. "Ah, here you are," she said, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You're at table 27. My heart sank the moment I found table 27. It was situated in the furthest corner of the reception hall, almost completely obscured behind a large decorative column. It was so far from the main stage and the head table that I knew I would barely be able to see Leo during the ceremony and speeches. My gaze fell upon the other place cards at the table, and the feeling of dread intensified. I recognized the names: the family's former landscaper, the stylist who occasionally did Daniel's hair, the personal driver for Jessica's mother. It was a collection of people who were clearly not part of the family's inner circle. We were the guests invited not out of genuine desire, but out of a sense of detached obligation. "Grandpa, you made it." Leo's voice, bright and cheerful, sounded from behind me. I turned, my face breaking into what I hoped was a convincing smile, and pulled him into a hug. He looked so handsome and happy in his tuxedo. "Of course I came, son," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I wouldn't miss this for the entire world." Leo's eyes flickered towards the table number where I stood, and I saw a flash of something in his expression. Was it embarrassment, or perhaps just discomfort? He quickly looked away, his smile becoming a little strained. "Is your seat okay, Mom?" Jessica organized all the seating arrangements. "It's perfect," I lied, forcing the smile to remain plastered on my face. "Don't you worry about me for a second." He seemed visibly relieved by my easy acceptance and was quickly whisked away by a photographer for another round of pictures. "I have to go, Grandpa. I'll see you later." The hours that followed were a masterclass in feeling invisible. No one approached my table to speak with me, aside from the other obligatory guests who shared my remote corner of the room. From my disadvantaged viewpoint, I could see my son, Daniel, moving effortlessly among the more prominent guests, his laughter echoing as he posed for photographs. Jessica was right there with him, a proud and poised figure in her expensive gown. It was like I was watching a film of my own family's life, in which I had been cast as an insignificant extra. Later, during dinner, I excused myself to use the restroom. On my way back, I passed a small office that the venue staff was using as a temporary storage room for gifts and personal belongings. The door had been left slightly ajar, and I could clearly hear voices from within. It was Daniel, talking with one of his close friends, a man named Mark. "I still can't believe you seated him so far back," Mark said, his voice carrying the slightly slurred edge of someone who'd had a bit too much champagne. "What else was I supposed to do?" Daniel retorted, his tone defensive. "Put him at the main table so he could bore everyone to tears with his rambling old stories? You know what he's like. Besides, Jessica is trying to impress the senior partners from the firm, and honestly, Mark, he just doesn't fit with the whole aesthetic we've created here." "But he's your father, Dan, and I invited him, didn't I?" Daniel snapped back. "Believe me, just getting Jessica to agree to that was a battle. She thought we could just not send him an invitation. But I explained that would cause way too much drama. This is a better solution. He's technically present, but he's not in the way. He doesn't interfere. And the photographer has specific instructions, just a few obligatory shots with him, and make sure they're kept separate from the main album." The room began to tilt and spin around me. My own son. My child was speaking about me as if I were a piece of inconvenient luggage, a social embarrassment, an unwanted obligation he was forced to endure. I felt a physical pain in my chest, as if my heart were breaking into 1,000 tiny pieces. My legs trembled, and I wasn't sure they could support the sudden, crushing weight of this revelation. I returned to table 27 on autopilot, my face a carefully constructed mask to hide the violent storm raging inside me. Daniel's cruel words echoed in my ears, a devastating soundtrack that mixed with a lifetime of memories. I thought of the countless sleepless nights I'd spent by his bedside when he was sick with a fever, the years I worked 2, sometimes 3, jobs just to pay for his college education. I remembered the unconditional support I had offered him when he and Jessica became pregnant with Leo while they were still in school. It was in that moment, with a clarity that was both painful and absolute, that I understood I had been relegated to the category of the undesirable. I was the guest they had to tolerate, not the family they wanted to celebrate. The weight of that knowledge felt almost too heavy to bear. When dinner concluded and the band began to play, I remained seated, a silent observer of the celebration from which I had been so thoroughly excluded. I watched Daniel dance with Jessica, then with her mother. I watched Leo twirl his new bride across the floor, both of them radiant and lost in their happiness. Not once did anyone look in my direction. Not a single person noticed when I finally picked up my coat and my purse and quietly stood up. On my way out, I stopped at the gift table. I placed the generous check I had so carefully saved for on the pristine white linen. Beside it, I set down the small, velvet-lined box containing my father's watch, a family treasure that now felt as painfully out of place in this opulent setting as I did. With one final, lingering look at the brightly lit hall, where my family was celebrating without a thought for me, I slipped out through a side door into the cool night air. As I drove home, alone in the profound darkness of the car, I felt something inside me shift and harden. The tears that had threatened to fall seemed to dry up before they even had a chance. In their place, a cold, clear, and unshakable resolution began to form. I would never, ever allow myself to be treated this way again. If they saw me as dispensable, as someone to be hidden away, then I would become exactly that, absent from their lives. For decades, I had placed my family above everything else, sacrificing my own dreams, my time, and my well-being for their sake. And this was my reward to be hidden behind a column, systematically excluded from their official memories and spoken of as an inconvenience. No, this would not stand. This humiliation would be the very last one I would ever endure. When I walked through the door of my silent house that night, I didn't cry, as they might have expected a rejected old grandfather to do. Instead, I went to my desk, sat down, and began to plan. If they wanted to edit me out of the family album, then I would simply rewrite the entire story from start to finish. That night, after the wedding, sleep was an impossibility. I sat in my small, quiet living room, surrounded by the framed photographs that adorned every surface. They now seemed like artifacts from a different universe, a parallel life where I had once mattered deeply to my family. I picked up one of them, Daniel at his high school graduation, his smile wide and full of promise, as I stood proudly at his side, my arm around his shoulders. I remembered with a sharp pang that I had worked 3 jobs that year just to afford his college application fees. My house was utterly silent, save for the steady rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a piece that had belonged to my late wife, Eleanor. She had been gone for 15 years now. 15 long years of navigating life's relentless challenges on my own, of trying to be both a mother and a father to Daniel, of being the only grandparent Leo had ever known. Eleanor had died when Daniel was just 19. Her heart had simply given out, without any warning, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. She collapsed right there at the breakfast table, her coffee still warm in its mug. By the time the paramedics arrived, she was already gone. Just like that, my partner of 23 years, the love of my life, had vanished. We had some modest savings and a small life insurance policy, but with the cost of everything, it wasn't nearly enough. Daniel was in his 2nd year at Briarwood College, an expensive private institution in another state that he had his heart set on since he was a little boy. Eleanor and I had promised him we would make it happen, no matter what it took. With her gone, that promise fell squarely on my shoulders. The first thing I did was sell our family car, resorting to city bus routes and the occasional ride from kind neighbors to get around. Then, I picked up evening shifts waiting tables at the local diner, in addition to my full-time day job as a high school history teacher. On the weekends, I took on freelance work, typing up legal documents for a law firm downtown. It was mind-numbing, tedious work that I would do late into the night, until my fingers cramped and my eyes burned from staring at the screen. 3 jobs, precious little sleep, and a persistent dull ache in my chest that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. This became my life. "Dad, you don't have to do all this," Daniel had said during one of his visits home from college, after finding me slumped over, fast asleep at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of legal briefs. "I can transfer to the state university. It's so much cheaper." "No," I had insisted, my voice firm despite my weariness. "Your mother wanted this for you. We planned for this. Nothing has changed." But of course, everything had changed. I just couldn't bear the thought of his dreams becoming another casualty of Eleanor's death. I remembered the day Daniel met Jessica during his final year at Briarwood. She came from money, the kind of old money that speaks in hushed tones. Her father was a renowned surgeon, her mother a partner at a prestigious law firm. Her childhood home wasn't just a house, it had its own name, Oak Ridge Manor. She was ambitious, beautiful, and seemed utterly captivated by my son. When Daniel brought her home to meet me for the first time, I saw our modest 3-bedroom house through her eyes. Eyes that had clearly grown accustomed to marble foyers and glittering crystal chandeliers. I watched as Daniel nervously straightened the faded throw pillows on the couch and apologized for the familiar creak in the hallway floor. "Your home is so quaint, Mr. Holmes," Jessica had said, her polite smile never quite reaching her eyes as she surveyed our small living room. "Daniel has told me so much about his childhood here. I serve them my best pot roast on the good china I save for special occasions." Daniel barely touched his food. Later, I overheard them whispering in the kitchen. "It's just temporary," Daniel had assured her. "Once I graduate, we won't have to come back here very often." The memory of that whisper stung as freshly as if it had been spoken just moments ago, as I sat there alone in the aftermath of the wedding. I set the graduation photo down and picked up another. Leo, as a newborn, cradled in my arms. Daniel had called me in a panic from his apartment near campus during his senior year. "Dad, Jessica's pregnant," he'd sobbed into the phone. "Her parents will disown her if they find out. Her mother has her whole career path planned out, and it definitely does not include a baby right now. I don't know what to do." I got in my car and drove to him that very night. A 3-hour journey on dark, unfamiliar highways, with a cold rain pelleting the windshield of the used car I had finally been able to afford. When I arrived, he fell into my arms, his entire body shaking with fear and uncertainty. "We will figure this out," I promised him, holding him tight. "Together." And we did. I took a leave of absence from my teaching job to help them through the pregnancy. I was there in the delivery room when Leo entered the world, his tiny, furious cries filling the sterile space as Daniel squeezed my hand so hard I thought my fingers might break. Jessica's parents were furious at first, but they eventually came to accept the situation on the strict condition that Jessica would still join her mother's firm as planned after she graduated. "We're going to need help with the baby," Daniel had told me one evening as he rocked a fussy Leo to sleep. "Just until Jessica finishes her degree." Just until turned into 3 full years. I moved into a small apartment near them and became Leo's primary caregiver. I picked him up from daycare when Daniel had late classes, and I kept him overnight whenever Jessica had important business dinners. I was the one who sang him lullabies, kissed his scraped knees, and read him bedtime stories until his little eyelids grew heavy. When Jessica finally graduated, her career took off almost immediately. They bought their first house in an upscale neighborhood, and suddenly my daily presence was no longer required. "We've hired a full-time nanny," Daniel informed me over lunch one day. "She has excellent references and a degree in early childhood education." "Oh," I'd said, doing my best to conceal the sharp pang of disappointment. "That's wonderful. You've done so much, Dad," he added, patting my hand in a gesture that felt both grateful and dismissive. "It's time you had your own life back." But what he didn't understand was that Leo had become my life. Being separated from him felt like losing a limb. Still, I respected their decision and stepped back. I returned to teaching full-time and transitioned to seeing Leo on scheduled weekend visits. I watched from a distance as Daniel and Jessica climbed the social ladder, moving to ever larger houses, joining exclusive country clubs, and attending all the right charity events. I was always invited for holidays and birthdays, but I consistently felt slightly out of place among their new, polished friends, with their designer clothes and casual conversations about expensive vacations to places I knew I would never see. I continued to bring homemade gifts, things I'd made with my own hands because they felt meaningful, even as I noticed them being quietly set aside in favor of the extravagant, store-bought presents from everyone else. Then came the Christmas when Leo was 7. I had spent months in my workshop carving him a detailed set of wooden figures from his favorite storybook. When he unwrapped it, his eyes lit up with pure delight. "Look, Dad, it's Sir Reginald and the Dragon's Keep. Grandpa made it." Daniel had offered a tight, forced smile. "That's nice, buddy. Now, why don't you open the gift from Mom and me?" It was the latest, most expensive video game console, a sleek black box that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. My hand-carved figures were forgotten within minutes. Later that night, after Leo had gone to bed, Daniel pulled me aside. "Dad, about the gifts?" he began hesitantly. "Jessica and I were thinking maybe next year you could just contribute to a larger gift we're already getting him, something from the list we send out to everyone." "You want me to chip in on your presents instead of bringing my own?" I asked, confused. "It's just that, well, Leo is getting to an age where he notices these things. The other kids at his school, their grandparents give them store-bought things," I finished for him. "Expensive things." "I didn't mean it like that," he said, but his eyes told a different story. As I sat there in the silence of my home after the wedding, these memories came flooding back. Each one a piece of evidence I had willfully overlooked. Each one a warning sign I had chosen to ignore. For years, I had been slowly and systematically pushed to the margins of my own family. And yet, I always showed up. When Leo had the chicken pox and both Daniel and Jessica were too busy with work to stay home, I took a week of my own sick leave to care for him. When Daniel needed an emergency appendectomy, I stayed at their house for 10 days, cooking, cleaning, and making sure Leo's routine wasn't disrupted in the slightest. When Jessica's mother broke her hip and couldn't host their annual Thanksgiving dinner, I opened my modest home to their entire extended family, spending 2 weeks preparing a feast that Daniel later described to his friends as refreshingly rustic. I gave and I gave until giving became my sole identity, until sacrifice became as natural and unconscious as breathing. And what had it all earned me? A seat at table 27, instructions to the wedding photographer to keep me out of the main album, and the soul-crushing knowledge that my own son considered me an embarrassment. The grandfather clock chimed midnight as I carefully placed the photographs back on the shelf. The house felt too quiet, too empty, too full of the ghosts of a past I could no longer reclaim. I went to my desk and pulled out a fresh, empty notebook. On the first page, in bold, clear letters, I wrote, "The next chapter," because that's what this was going to be. Not an ending. I refused to let them write me off so easily, but a new beginning. For decades, I had lived my life for others. Now, it was time to live for myself. My phone began to ring, Daniel's name flashing on the screen. He was likely calling to make sure I had gotten home safely, or perhaps more cynically, to ensure I hadn't made a scene by leaving early. For the first time in my entire life, I looked at his name, took a deep breath, and let the call go to voicemail. That small act of rebellion felt like taking my first full, deep breath in years. The morning after the wedding, I woke to the sight of 6 missed calls from Daniel and a new text message that read, "Dad, where did you go? Jessica's parents noticed you were missing during the cake cutting. Call me." There was no, "Are you okay?" No, "I hope you got home safely." Just a raw concern for appearances, for what Jessica's influential parents might think. I set the phone aside without replying and made myself a cup of strong black coffee. As I sat at my kitchen table watching the early morning light filter through the curtains Eleanor had hung decades ago, I began to see the patterns in Daniel's behavior that I had willfully ignored for so many years. The wedding seating arrangement wasn't an isolated incident. It was merely the most blatant in a long, painful series of subtle exclusions and dismissals. 3 months earlier, Daniel had hosted a pre-wedding brunch for Leo's groomsmen and close family. I only found out about it when Leo casually mentioned it during one of our phone calls. "Oh, Grandpa, the brunch at Dad's was amazing. He had that caterer from downtown make those little crab cakes you like so much." I had stammered my way through a response, pretending that I had been invited but simply couldn't attend, unwilling to put my grandson in an uncomfortable position. Later, when I gently asked Daniel about it, his response was dismissive and glib. "It was all very last minute, Dad. And you know how much you hate driving in the city. I just didn't think you'd want to come all that way for a simple brunch." Then there was Leo's college graduation 2 years before that. I had arranged to take the time off work months in advance, only to discover the week before the ceremony that Daniel had booked only 4 seats at a special graduation dinner at an exclusive 5-star restaurant. "It's for Jessica's parents, us, and Leo," he had explained, not even trying to sound apologetic. The restaurant couldn't possibly accommodate any more people at such short notice. But hey, we can all meet for coffee before the ceremony. Coffee before the ceremony, as if I were a distant acquaintance, not the man who had helped raise Leo during his most formative years. And last Christmas, I had been invited to their home as usual, but upon arriving, I discovered that the formal family portrait session Daniel had scheduled with a professional photographer was already finished. "Oh, we did that earlier this morning," Daniel had said with a casual wave of his hand. "Jessica had a conference call later this afternoon, and you know how she gets when she feels rushed." The doorbell rang, startling me out of my reverie. I peered through the peephole and saw Daniel standing on my porch, his expression a familiar mixture of annoyance and feigned concern. I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the doorknob. This confrontation was inevitable. I knew that if I wanted to establish new boundaries, I couldn't simply avoid him forever. I took a deep breath and opened the door, but I made a point not to step aside and invite him in as I normally would have. "Dad," he said, his voice tight with frustration, Why aren't you answering your phone? I've been calling you all morning." "I've been busy," I replied simply, my tone even and calm. He looked taken aback by my flat delivery. "Busy? Busy doing what?" "You left the wedding last night without saying goodbye to anyone. Jessica's mother was asking about you." "Was she really?" I asked, unable to keep the note of skepticism out of my voice. "Or was she just checking to make sure I hadn't done anything to embarrass you and Jessica?" Daniel's eyes widened in surprise. "What is that supposed to mean?" "I think you know exactly what it means, Daniel." I kept my voice steady, even as my heart began to race. "I heard you and your friend Mark talking in the office last night. I heard you talking about why you placed me at table 27, to keep me out of the way. I heard you mention the photographer's instructions to keep me out of the main album." The color drained from his face. "You were eavesdropping." "I was walking back from the restroom and happened to overhear my own name being discussed," I corrected him. "Should I have announced my presence so you could have pretended you hadn't just called your own father an embarrassment?" "What do you want from me, Dad?" he asked, his voice suddenly small and strained. It was a question I had never truly considered before. What did I want from my son? "I want to be treated with basic respect and consideration," I said finally, the words feeling solid and real as I spoke them. "I want to be valued for who I am, not hidden away because I don't fit the new image you and your wife are trying to project. But more than anything else, I want to stop putting my entire life on hold for people who so clearly don't appreciate it." Daniel just stared at me, looking utterly stricken. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that things are going to change, Daniel. I will no longer be at your beck and call. I will not be rearranging my life to accommodate yours. And I most certainly will not be showing up to family functions just to be publicly humiliated." He stared at me, as if he were seeing a complete stranger. And in some ways, perhaps he was. The father he had always known would have backed down by now, would have accepted a half-hearted apology and allowed things to return to the familiar, painful pattern of him giving too much and receiving far too little in return. But that man was gone. He had been left behind at table 27, along with the family heirloom and the generous check. I have to go," Daniel said finally, his voice unsteady. "Leo and his new wife are having a post-wedding brunch. Everyone will be wondering where I am." "Of course," I said, a bitter edge to my voice. "Appearances are important." He flinched at my words, then turned and walked away. At the bottom of my porch steps, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "Will you at least call Leo? He was really upset that you left without saying goodbye." "I'll call him tomorrow," I promised. "Today, I have plans of my own." For the first time since Eleanor had died, I felt a sense of genuine control over my own life. The road ahead was uncertain, and I knew it might even be lonely at times, but it was finally mine to choose. No longer would I be a footnote in someone else's story. It was time to start writing my own. After Daniel left, I returned to my notebook and the lists I had been making throughout the morning. What had started as a simple, cathartic exercise was now transforming into something more tangible, a blueprint for my new life. A life where I would no longer be orbiting around Daniel's family like a forgotten, distant satellite. I pulled out my laptop and logged into my online banking. The balance in my savings account wasn't impressive by any means, but it was enough to make a start. I had been saving that money for years to help Leo with his wedding, but it had gone untouched. Now, it would serve a new and far more important purpose: my own happiness. The first thing I did was enroll in a woodworking class at the local community college. Building things with my hands had been a passion of mine in my youth, before I met Eleanor, before life's many responsibilities had pushed my creative pursuits to the sidelines. The course started the following Tuesday evening. The very same evening I usually watched Leo's dog when he and Daniel had their monthly dinner appointments. They would have to make other arrangements from now on. Next, I booked a trip to the Grand Canyon for the following month. It wasn't the trip to Italy I had always dreamed of that would require more significant planning, but it was a start. Eleanor and I had always talked about seeing it together one day. Now, I would go alone, carrying her memory with me in a way that felt quiet and right. My phone buzzed with another text from Daniel. I read it reluctantly. "Dad, we really need to talk about this. Jessica thinks you're completely overreacting. Can you please just call me?" Jessica thinks. Of course she does. I didn't bother to respond. Instead, I went to my closet and began sorting through my clothes. Most of my wardrobe consisted of practical, unremarkable pieces I had selected for comfort and durability rather than for style. They were the clothes of a man who didn't want to stand out or draw attention at family gatherings. The clothes of a man trying to fade into the background. I pulled out anything I hadn't worn in over a year and placed it in a pile for donation. By the time I had finished, my closet was half empty. But what remained were pieces that I genuinely liked. Tomorrow, I decided, I would go shopping for the first time in years, and I wouldn't spend a single second wondering if my choices would meet with Daniel's or Jessica's approval. The doorbell rang again in the late afternoon. This time, it was Leo. His eyes were red-rimmed and his hair was uncombed, a stark contrast to the radiant, polished groom from the day before. Unlike with his father, I immediately stepped aside to let him in. "Grandpa," he said, his voice breaking, "why did you leave last night? I was looking everywhere for you after we cut the cake." The hurt in his eyes was so genuine that for a moment my resolve wavered. Of all the members of my family, Leo was the only one who had consistently made me feel truly wanted. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," I said gently. I wasn't feeling well, and it seemed better to just slip out quietly rather than make a big fuss. It wasn't the whole truth, but I couldn't bring myself to burden him with my pain, not when he was still glowing from his wedding day. "Dad said you two had a fight this morning," he pressed, following me into the kitchen. "He was crying when he finally showed up at the brunch." I busied myself with making tea, buying time to formulate a response that wouldn't place Leo directly in the middle of this conflict. "Your father and I have some things we need to work through," I said carefully, "but that is strictly between us. It has absolutely nothing to do with you or with how much I love you." Leo sat down at the kitchen table, his eyes scanning the stacks of papers and the open notebook where I had been planning my new life. His gaze lingered on the brochure for the Grand Canyon tour. "You're going on a trip?" he asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Yes," I replied, setting a mug of hot tea in front of him. "It's something I've always wanted to do." "By yourself?" "Yes, by myself." He looked troubled by this, though I couldn't quite understand why. "But you've never traveled alone before." "There are a lot of things I've never done before," I said, a small smile softening my words. "It's about time I started, don't you think?" "I guess," he said, still frowning. "It's just, I don't know, it's different." We sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, sipping our tea. I could practically see the questions forming behind his eyes, the confusion as he tried to reconcile the grandfather he had always known, the one who was always available, always accommodating, with the man who was now sitting across from him, booking solo trips and enrolling in woodworking classes. "Grandpa?" he finally asked, his voice soft. "Are you okay? Really okay?" The genuine concern in his voice touched me deeply. Despite everything, despite being raised in a world of privilege and status, Leo had somehow managed to maintain a kind and genuine heart. "I'm getting there," I answered honestly. For a long time, I haven't really been living my own life. I've been living in the margins of yours and your father's. It's time for me to change that. Is this because of what happened at the wedding? He pressed. I reached across the table and took his hand in mine. The wedding was just the final piece of a puzzle that I've been trying very hard not to see for years. This isn't about punishment, Leo. This is about me finally taking care of myself the way I've always taken care of everyone else. He nodded slowly, though I could tell he didn't fully understand. And how could he? At 26 years old, newly married, with the entire world at his feet, he couldn't possibly comprehend the quiet desperation of a man who had surrendered his identity so completely to others that he had nearly lost himself entirely. "Will you still come to Sunday dinners?" he asked in a small voice. "My husband and I want to start hosting them at our new place once we get back from the honeymoon." "Of course I will," I assured him, squeezing his hand. "Nothing will ever change between us. I promise you that." As I walked him to the door later, he hugged me tightly. "I love you, Grandpa, more than you know." "I love you too, sweetheart, always." After he left, I returned to my planning with a renewed sense of determination. Seeing Leo had reminded me of what was still worth fighting for, the genuine connections in my life stripped of all obligation and performance. The phone rang again. Daniel, persistent as ever. This time I answered. "Dad, finally," he began, his voice tense. "We need to talk about this." "Not today, Daniel," I said firmly. "I need some time. Goodbye." I hung up and turned the ringer off on my phone. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own difficult conversations. But tonight belonged to me, to my dreams, my plans, and my future. The old Arthur would have spent the entire evening worrying about Daniel's feelings, making excuses for his behavior, and trying to find ways to smooth things over. The new Arthur poured himself a glass of good wine, opened a book he'd been meaning to read for months, and allowed himself, perhaps for the first time in decades, to put his own happiness first. It wasn't a dramatic gesture of defiance. There were no slammed doors, no heated ultimatums, just a quiet, firm decision to reclaim my life, one small choice at a time. And somehow, that felt more powerful than any grand declaration ever could. 1 month after the wedding, I stood on the rim of the Grand Canyon, watching in awe as the sunset painted the ancient rock formations in breathtaking shades of gold, orange, and crimson. The sheer vastness of the landscape stretching out before me was humbling, a profound reminder of how small our human concerns really are against the immense backdrop of geological time. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said beside me. A man who looked to be about my age was setting up a camera on a tripod nearby. He had a warm smile and kind eyes. "It's more than I ever could have imagined," I replied honestly. "First time here?" he asked. "First time anywhere in a very long while," I admitted. His name was Walter, a retired history professor from Portland, who was traveling across the country by himself, photographing all the national parks. We exchanged stories and quickly discovered a shared passion for the past. He invited me to join him for dinner that evening, and just like that, I had made my first new friend in decades. Over plates of savory southwestern food, Walter shared tales of his travels, his long career, and his late wife. Unlike the strained, superficial conversations I was used to at Daniel's family gatherings, where I always felt like I was being silently judged and assessed, this exchange was easy, natural, and incredibly refreshing. "So, what was it that finally got you out here?" Walter asked as we finished our meal. "You mentioned it's been a while since you've traveled." I found myself telling him the whole story about the wedding, about Table 27, about my decision to finally reclaim my life. There was something incredibly liberating about sharing my experience with a complete stranger, someone who had no preconceived notions about me and no personal stake in the narrative. "Good for you," he said sincerely when I finished, raising his water glass in a toast. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," I echoed, feeling a genuine, unforced smile spread across my face. My woodworking class had been an equally revolutionary experience. After decades away from the craft, my first few attempts were clumsy and uncertain, but there was an immense joy in the process itself, in feeling the grain of the wood under my fingers, in watching a simple block of pine transform into something new, in creating something purely for my own pleasure without a single thought for anyone else's judgment. The instructor, a gentleman named Marcus, with kind eyes and sawdust in his hair, encouraged experimentation and playfulness over technical perfection. "The goal isn't to create masterpieces," he told the class during our first session. "It's to rediscover the part of yourself that creates for the pure joy of it." I had nearly forgotten that such joy even existed. Years of calculating my worth based on my usefulness to others had dimmed that inner light to almost nothing. But now, shaving by shaving, cut by cut, it was slowly but surely rekindling. Upon my return from the Grand Canyon, I found 3 new voicemails from Daniel. The first 2 were filled with increasingly frustrated demands that I call him back immediately. The third, left after a full week of my silence, was more subdued. "Dad, please call me. I don't understand what's happening. Leo says you're traveling, taking woodworking classes. We need to talk about this." I did call him back, but I did it on my own terms, when I felt ready. We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop halfway between our homes. Daniel arrived, looking harried and defensive. "I've been trying to reach you for weeks," he said accusingly as soon as he sat down. "I needed some time," I replied calmly. "I've been busy." "Busy?" he repeated, as if the very concept of me having a life that was independent of his needs was completely incomprehensible. "Dad, what is going on with you? First, you disappear from the wedding, then you refuse to talk to me, and now Leo tells me you're traveling the country by yourself and taking up woodworking. It's bizarre." "Yes," I said simply. "I am. But why? Is this some kind of, I don't know, a midlife crisis?" "It's not a crisis, Daniel," I interrupted gently. "And it is not about punishing you for the seating arrangement at the wedding. It's about me finally making myself a priority after decades of putting everyone else first." He stared at me, genuinely perplexed. "I don't understand. What does that even mean?" "It means that I am no longer available on demand," I explained. "I have my own life now, my own interests, my own plans. I will still be a part of your lives, but it will be on more equal terms." "Equal terms?" he echoed, his voice rising slightly in disbelief. "Dad, we're family. There aren't terms." "That is precisely the problem," I said. "Family should be built on a foundation of mutual respect and consideration. For years I have shown up whenever you've called, rearranged my entire schedule to accommodate yours, and silently accepted being treated as an afterthought. That is what's changing now." His expression hardened. "So you are punishing me?" "No, Daniel. I'm respecting myself. There is a difference." We talked in circles for nearly an hour, with Daniel cycling through defensiveness, guilt-tripping, and occasional fleeting moments of what seemed like genuine confusion. I maintained my calm and held firm to my new boundaries. "I have a yoga class at 6, I finally said, gathering my things. "I need to go." "Yoga?" Daniel looked as if I had just announced I was leaving for Mars. "Since when do you do yoga?" "Since 2 weeks ago," I replied with a small smile. "I'm enjoying it." As I stood to leave, Daniel reached out and caught my hand. "Dad, please, I don't want to lose you." The raw vulnerability in his voice touched me. Despite everything, he was still my son, the little boy I had raised by myself, the person who had been the absolute center of my world for so many years. "You're not losing me, Daniel," I said softly. "You're just meeting the real me for the first time in a very long time, the me who has his own needs and his own dreams. The me who deserves to be seen and valued, not hidden away at table 27. I saw something flicker in his eyes, then a hint of recognition perhaps, or the very beginnings of understanding. But we both knew that real, lasting change wouldn't happen overnight. Years of established patterns couldn't be rewritten in a single conversation. "Sunday dinner at Leo's next week," he said as I turned to go. "Will you be there?" "I will," I promised. "But I'll be bringing a dessert that I want to make. Not the one Jessica's mother prefers. And I'll be leaving by 8 for a photography class I just signed up for." Daniel nodded slowly, still trying to process this new reality where his father had boundaries and expectations of his own. As I walked away from the coffee shop, I felt lighter than I had in years. The path ahead was still uncertain, and my relationship with my son was still fragile and in flux. But for the first time, I was walking with my head held high, no longer willing to make myself smaller, just to fit into the cramped space that others had designated for me. I was rediscovering not just old passions, but a new sense of self-worth that had absolutely nothing to do with my usefulness to other people. Each class I took, each trip I planned, each new friend I made was another piece of myself that I reclaimed from the shadows. The man who had sat alone and invisible at table 27 was fading away, making room for someone stronger, more authentic, and at long last, genuinely alive. 2 years passed more quickly than I could have ever imagined. My life, once defined by waiting for Daniel's calls and Leo's occasional visits, was now rich with activity and purpose. I finally took that trip to Italy, where I stood in awe before the art of Florence and rode a gondola through the canals of Venice, fulfilling a dream I had held for decades. My woodworking skills had improved so much that 3 of my pieces, a small table and 2 hand-carved boxes, were displayed in a local gallery's community exhibition. On a crisp autumn Sunday, I was preparing to host one of my now regular dinners with my photography group when my doorbell rang. Daniel stood on my porch, alone, and without the usual polished, confident appearance he always maintained. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his shoulders were slumped in defeat. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking on the single word, "I need your help." 2 years ago, I would have immediately dropped everything to solve whatever crisis he was facing. But the man I had become paused, taking a deliberate breath before responding. "Come in," I said. "I have about an hour before I need to leave for dinner with my friends." He nodded, accepting this boundary in a way the old Daniel never would have. As we sat in my living room, which had been completely redecorated with artifacts from my travels and pieces from my woodworking class, he told me about his struggles. Jessica's law firm had lost a major client, and their financial situation, while far from dire, was strained enough that they might need to significantly downsize their lavish lifestyle. The country club membership, Leo's car payments, the vacation house in the mountains. "We can't maintain everything," he admitted, his voice thick with shame. "And you're here because," I prompted gently. "Because I don't know how to handle this," he said with a raw honesty I hadn't heard from him in years. "You always managed," Even when things were so tight after Mom died, you never crumbled. You always found a way. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, I saw something in his eyes that had been missing for a very long time. Respect. I can't solve this problem for you, Daniel, I said carefully. But I can listen. I can support you while you figure it out for yourself. That's all I'm asking for, he replied, surprising me. Just be my dad. The way you always were before I started pushing you away. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. There were still awkward moments, still occasions when old destructive patterns threatened to re-emerge. But it was a beginning, a real one. Later that month, Leo invited me to lunch, just the two of us. Over salads and iced tea, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Grandpa, I owe you an apology," he said, his expression serious. "I should have stood up for you at the wedding. I knew what my dad and Jessica were doing was wrong, and I didn't say anything. You were the groom, sweetheart," I told him. "It wasn't your responsibility to fight that battle. Still," he insisted, "I want you to know that I see you, the real you, and I admire you so much for everything you've done these past 2 years." As I drove home that afternoon, I realized that the deep wound of Table 27 had finally, truly begun to heal. Not because I had been welcomed back into the fold on their terms, but because I had created a life for myself where their approval was no longer necessary for my happiness. I was Arthur Holmes, artist, traveler, friend, teacher, father, and grandfather. Every single one of those roles was important, but none of them defined me completely. Table 27 had been intended as an insult, a cruel way to hide me away in the shadows. Instead, it had become the unlikely catalyst for my liberation. And for that, I was unexpectedly and profoundly grateful. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.